Previously, we talked about how to build a crosstab for two variables. And in this lecture, we'll talk about how you can control for a third variable, how you can consider a potential confound through crosstabs. So we've already learned the basics of how to set up crosstabs, and we'll be using those. So to talk through this, I'm just going to go through an example and show how that can enable us to control for a third variable using these crosstabs. So our example is that we imagine that there is a relationship between regime type and signing environmental treaties. So our hypothesis is that democracies are more likely to sign an environmental treaty than non-democracies. Perhaps you believe that democracies are more likely to sign this treaty because they'll be more responsive to their people, and people will demand that their countries think in the long term. Okay. So this is your hypothesis. And so reviewing what we've talked about setting up causal diagrams, the independent variable here is regime type, whether a country is democracy or not a democracy. And we think that it has a causal relationship with y, or our dependent variable, whether or not the country has signed a treaty. And so if we were to put this into a crosstab, we have signing treaty and not signing the treaty. So our rows here going across this way, these are the dependent variable, right? Whether or not they sign the treaty, okay? And then our columns are the independent variable, whether a country is or is not a democracy. Okay, so what we need to do here is to take the countries that we have and to break them down into these different rows and columns. So we see that a total of 110 have signed the treaty and 83 didn't sign the treaty. It's a total of 193 countries in the world. And then if you were to break them down by which countries are democracy and not democracies, 123 countries are democracies and 70 are not. Okay, so this is before we've actually inserted anything into the cells of the crosstab, just thinking about how we would divide up countries in general. Okay, so let's look at how democracies behaved. So 75 of the 123 democracies, or 61%, signed the treaty. And then 48 out of the 123, or 39%, did not sign the treaty. Okay, so there's 61% have signed and 39% have not. By the way, I made up these numbers. It's just a hypothetical example. And then looking at the non-democracies, we see that 35 out of 70 have signed it, and then 35 out of 70 did not sign it. Okay, so 50-50. Compare this with 61-39. And the key here is to look and see whether countries are a democracy were more likely to sign the treaty than countries that weren't a democracy. Okay, so 61-50, 39-50. We see a positive, or we see a relationship where countries that are democracies are more likely to sign the treaty than those that are not democracies. Okay, right, so this is what we see in just our bivariate analysis. This should seem familiar to you. This is what we covered already earlier on. Okay, so the question is, can we control for confounds in any way? So you have a thought that maybe there's a confound going on here. There's a level of development. And so if that were true, you get rid of that causal arrow that we saw here, and instead you have a curved arrow. Because you think that having a democracy and signing a treaty, those are correlated, but it's not necessarily a causal relationship. You see that we need to take into consideration level of development as well. So drawing the causal diagram here that for a relationship you're proposing is at a level of development, that's going to be determining whether a country is signing the treaty. Countries that are more developed will be more likely to sign the treaty, you think, because they have already taken advantage of the opportunity to use fossil fuels and reach a level of industrialization. So it's a lot easier for them to say, oh no, we need to be environmentalists now that they've established a certain level of development. So here, the level of development is going to be causing whether or not countries would sign the treaty. And a level of development isn't necessarily causing a country to be not democratic. So this is correlated. This is a correlated cause, right? That countries that are less developed are also more likely to be non-democracies. And that's why you see this relationship, right? That what's really going on is the overall level of development. So how do we take this and apply it to our discussion of crosstabs? So first, we divide countries in the world into two groups, developed countries and less developed countries. So we find that there are 83 developed countries and 110 less developed countries. You would need to clearly conceptualize and operationalize what you mean by being a developed country in the first place. But so here's just numbers that I decided we were going to be using. Okay, so then you create new crosstabs. You create two new crosstabs, one for developed countries and one for less developed countries. And so what you're doing here is you're looking at what is the relationship between democracy and signing that treaty once we control for having a certain level of development. Do you still observe that kind of relationship once you're controlling for level of development? And what controlling for really means is just comparing developed countries with developed countries and just comparing less developed countries with less developed countries. Okay, so we are looking here at the developed countries. So again, I said that there are 83 developed countries, and we find that 59 of them have signed the treaty, 24 did not. So let's look and see among developed democracies, how many of them are signing the treaty? And the number here is 74 compared to 26 that did not among democracies. So we see that there is this relationship that democratic developed countries are likely to sign the treaty. And in fact, this number is higher than what we saw earlier. It was higher than the overall data for democracies. And then here, it's the same proportion as what we saw before. Before it was 50-50, and likewise it's 50-50 for non-democracies. The key is comparing these two, right? So among democracy, or among people who are signing the treaty, are they more likely to be democracy? Yes, they are, right? So democracies are going to be more likely to sign that treaty. Let's look at less developed countries now, right? So here the total number is 110. We see 51 signed the treaty, 59 didn't, and then 50 are democracies and 60 are not democracies. So let's just start here, 50-50. Once again, it's been the same in all the data, right? That among non-democracies they're evenly split. But let's turn to democracies now. So among democracies, less than half have signed this treaty. All of a sudden, you're less likely to sign the treaty if you're a democracy in a less developed country. So here the difference is 42-48. So among democracies, are you less likely? Yes, you're less likely to do this. So how do we bring all of this together? The reason you do this is to then compare in the end the data that we see for developed countries and the data that we see for less developed countries. So I'm going to stack them and compare them here. So let's look at the less developed countries. Again, if you're a democracy, you're only 42% of those democracies signed the treaty. And we compare this with developed countries, where 74% signed the treaty, right? So in this relationship with developed countries, being democracy made you more likely to sign the treaty. Here, if you were a democracy, it made you less likely to sign the treaty. And so we see that what's going on here is that the relationship that we thought we saw pretty clearly, that democracies overall were more likely to sign the treaty, falls apart when we break it down by developed and less developed countries. Only certain kinds of democracies are more likely to sign this treaty. And so this is an important confound to take into consideration. So our conclusions, what do we conclude about this relationship overall, is that when we added this third variable, the level of development, it changed the results that we saw in the aggregate population. Controlling made a difference. So developed democracies were more likely than the average democracy to sign the treaty. And by average democracy, I just mean when you combine all the democracies of developed and less developed countries. So on average, developed democracies were more likely to sign that treaty, and less developed democracies were less likely than average democracies to sign the treaty. And so the level of development appears to be a confounding variable. And in future lectures, when we start talking about regression, we'll be moving beyond this general logic. And that's what I really want to emphasize with the crosstabs, developing the general logic and intuition about what controlling for a third variable means. And we'll talk about how to test to see if those relationships are statistically significant.